Lucian Dravon, the most feared Mafia boss in the city, thought he had left his past behind. Every night, he stared at her name on his phone. Elira Voss, the only woman who ever touched the monster inside him. Tonight, he couldn't resist. He called her. And when her face appeared on the screen, his world froze. Because in her arms was a baby. A baby with storm gray eyes. His eyes. Elira. Whose baby is that? His voice cracked, his heart shattered, and then the call ended. Lucian Dravon's life would never be the same again. Who is the baby? And how far will he go to protect what's his? Stay tuned, because this story of love, rage, and betrayal will leave you breathless. Lucian Dravon, the most feared and untouchable Mafia boss in the city, sat alone in the towering penthouse that overlooked the glittering skyline. A place that had always been his domain, yet tonight felt more like a cold cage than a throne. The marble floors beneath him reflecting the pale moonlight that streamed through the expansive windows, highlighting the sterile opulence of a life built on power, fear, and control, while simultaneously amplifying the emptiness that gnawed at him from within, for no amount of money, influence, or violence could fill the void left by the woman he could never forget, Elira Voss. He had spent years convincing everyone around him, and even himself, that he had moved on, that the chapters of love, loss, and vulnerability had been closed and burned behind him with the same ruthless precision he applied to his criminal empire. But every night, without fail, he would unlock his phone, scroll through the names, and linger on hers. The name that haunted his thoughts, burned into his memory with the sharpness of a blade, evoking memories he had tried desperately to bury, her laugh that had softened his edges, the warmth of her touch that had made him feel alive in ways no amount of power ever could, the way her eyes had seemed to see through the monster he had become into the man he had tried to hide. Tonight, something was different, though he couldn't name it at first. The ache in his chest was sharper, the pull toward her almost unbearable, as though every heartbeat was demanding he confront what he had suppressed for so long. And for the first time in years, Lucian allowed himself a moment of unfiltered vulnerability, running a hand through his dark hair, feeling the tension knot in his shoulders, whispering to himself with a voice raw and fractured, just once. I need to see her, a confession that carried equal parts longing and fear. For he knew the risk of crossing this invisible line. Yet the desire to witness her face, even for a fleeting moment, outweighed every shred of caution he had painstakingly cultivated. His fingers trembled as they hovered over the screen, and after a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, he tapped video call, committing himself to a choice that could ignite both ecstasy and destruction. And as the call rang, each tone bouncing through the empty apartment, his heart thumped in anticipation, a chaotic rhythm that reflected the storm of emotions surging through him. The fear that she had moved on, the terror that she might have erased him from her life completely. And yet, deep down, a fragile thread of hope persisted. Fragile as a candle flame against a gusting wind. Then, finally, the screen lit up. And there she was, Elira Voss, her expression frozen in surprise, her wide eyes locking onto his with a mixture of shock and something unspoken. Something that made his chest tighten and his pulse spike. And for a fleeting moment, a fragile flicker of hope ignited within him, as though the universe had given him a chance to reclaim a piece of the life he had lost. A chance to bridge the years of silence and separation. But that hope evaporated the instant he noticed what she was holding, a baby, delicate and small. Its storm-gray eyes, his own eyes, staring back at him, a living, breathing testament to a past he had never fully confronted. A child that embodied both innocence and a truth that threatened to shatter his carefully constructed world. His blood ran cold, his body stiffened, and words caught in his throat. For the realization hit him with the force of a cannonball. This child, this undeniable evidence of their connection, had existed in secret, growing, thriving, untouched by his knowledge, and yet now, staring back at him through the screen, it demanded confrontation, demanded reckoning, demanded that he acknowledge the life he had never known he fathered. Elira, whose baby is that? He asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief, fear, and an ache he could barely name. trembling even as it forced itself past his lips, and for a moment, the space between them was filled with silence, a taut, fragile thread of tension suspended in the digital ether. Before the unthinkable happened, the call ended. The screen went black, leaving Lucian staring at the glow of the monitor, chest heaving, hands trembling, mind spinning as the enormity of what he had just seen sank in, and in that silence, heavier than any gunshot or scream he had ever commanded or endured, he felt a crack open inside him. A vulnerability that the years of violence, power, and intimidation could never have prepared him for. A longing and terror intertwined, leaving him to sit alone, shaking, staring at a world that had suddenly shifted, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again, that the child, the woman, and the choices that had been hidden from him were now unavoidable realities demanding confrontation, reckoning, and perhaps the first steps toward a path he had never thought he would walk again. Lucian Dravon's fury erupted with a force that shook the room. His hands slamming against the polished mahogany table, rattling glasses and frames as the penthouse trembled under the impact of his rage. Every strike a physical manifestation of the storm raging inside him, a storm fueled by confusion, disbelief, and a tenderness he had long buried beneath the steel and blood of his empire. For the sight of the child had pierced the armor he had so meticulously built, exposing a vulnerability that terrified him even as it drew him in. A vulnerability he had not allowed anyone to witness and would never admit aloud, yet it coursed through his veins, mingling with the adrenaline of anger to create a whirlwind of emotions that left him raw, trembling, and somehow alive in ways that violence alone had never accomplished. His roar echoed through the penthouse, bouncing off the walls, each syllable a mixture of accusation, despair, and a primal hunger for answers. "I asked that. My child?" he bellowed, the sound tearing through the silence of the night like a predator's growl, resonating not with menace for his men, but with a raw, uncontainable force that even he could not control. And as the echo faded, he felt the trembling in his hands and legs. A physical response to a heart finally confronted by a truth it had longed to recognize yet feared to face. And he sank into the nearest leather armchair, burying his face in his hands, the weight of the moment pressing on him with suffocating intensity. Memories of Elira flooding his mind in rapid succession. Memories of laughter that had once softened his edges. Of whispered confessions in the quiet hours before dawn. Of moments where her presence had made the world feel fragile and yet safe. Now contrasted violently with the reality of the child she held. A child whose very existence was a revelation that shattered his sense of control and dominance. A living embodiment of a past he had ignored but could no longer deny. His mind raced, calculating every possible explanation, every scenario that could justify the sight he had just witnessed, while simultaneously feeling a tide of helplessness that was foreign to a man who had controlled life and death with precision. For nothing in his world had prepared him for the raw, unfiltered impact of seeing a piece of himself in another. The innocence and vulnerability of the storm-gray eyes staring back at him through the screen. Eyes that held questions he could not yet answer. Eyes that demanded he confront not just the mystery of the child, but the years of absence, separation, and unspoken truths that had led them to this moment. He rose abruptly, pacing the length of the penthouse with long, determined strides, his coat brushing against the edge of the table, his shadow stretching across the walls as if reaching for the past he had ignored. And with each step, he felt the conflict between the man he had trained himself to be, cold, ruthless, untouchable, and the man who had loved, who had been loved, and who was now confronted with a living testament to that love. A child he had never known, a child who demanded action, acknowledgement, and protection. The air in the room was thick with tension, charged with the electricity of a revelation that promised to upend everything he had built. And as he stopped to stare out over the city, the lights below blurred into streaks of gold and silver, mirroring the tumult of emotions swirling within him: fear, longing, anger, hope, and an unrelenting determination to reclaim what he had been denied, to understand what he had missed, and to confront the choices that Elira had made in his absence. He sank back into the chair, head leaning against the cold leather, whispering her name over and over: "Elira, each repetition a prayer, a curse, and a plea, as though speaking it aloud might summon her back, might offer answers to questions he had not yet formulated, might bridge the impossible distance that had grown between them in the years he had been blinded by power and pride. And yet the silence of the penthouse mocked him, reflecting the enormity of what had occurred and the uncertainty of the path ahead. He clenched his fists, feeling the pulse of his heartbeat in his palms. The reality of the child, the undeniable connection, and the profound implications pressing down on him with a weight heavier than any gun, any contract, any enemy he had ever faced. And he realized, with a clarity that was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, that his life, his empire, and his very soul had shifted irreversibly in a matter of seconds. And that until he found Elira, until he understood the full truth of the child in her arms, nothing could feel whole, nothing could feel certain. And the monster that ruled the city would have to confront the man who had been hiding inside him all along. Every instinct he had ever relied on screamed at him to act, to pursue, to demand answers, yet beneath the anger, beneath the roar, lay a tenderness, a raw and unshielded love that refused to be denied. A recognition that the child represented more than a secret kept or a life hidden, it represented the continuation of a bond that had never been broken. A living reminder that love, even in the darkest, most dangerous corners of his world, could not be destroyed. And as he sat there, chest heaving, eyes glistening with a mixture of fury and awe, he knew, with unshakable certainty, that he would move heaven and earth, confront any danger, and tear down any obstacle to uncover the truth, reclaim what had been kept from him, and face the consequences of a revelation that had already begun to reshape the very essence of Lucian Dravon, the man who had always believed himself untouchable, and yet now found himself shaken, terrified, and profoundly alive, because he had seen the child of Elira Voss, and in that moment, everything had changed forever. Elira Voss sank onto the worn leather couch, collapsing as if the weight of the world had finally found her and pressed her into the cushions. The baby cradled in her arms stirring slightly as her small hand brushed against Elira's collarbone, a reminder that life, fragile, relentless, and beautiful, was entirely in her care. And for a long moment, she let herself breathe, though the air was thick with panic, fear, and exhaustion, her body trembling not just from the adrenaline of the encounter moments ago, but from the realization that nothing in her careful, meticulously constructed life had prepared her for the chaos that now roared at her doorstep in the form of the man who had once been the center of her universe. The man whose name alone could make her heart pound and her resolve waver, Lucian Dravon. She pressed the baby closer, feeling the warmth, the heartbeat beneath her hand, and whispered softly, almost as if saying the words could shield them from the storm she knew was coming, "I wanted to protect you." From him, from his world, from everything, her voice quivering, catching on the syllables as tears streamed freely down her cheeks, a mixture of relief, guilt, and dread coiling together so tightly in her chest that it hurt to draw a single breath. 2 years had passed since that fateful night when she had fled the violent world Lucian inhabited. A night filled with blood, screams, and a betrayal that had been as much about survival as it had been about love. The memory of running through rain-slicked streets, clutching the life growing within her, replaying over and over in her mind with all the clarity of trauma and the dull ache of longing, reminding her that leaving had been both the hardest and the only choice she could make. The only way to give her child a chance at a life that was not defined by the chaos and darkness that followed Lucian wherever he went. In those years, she had built a fragile existence on the edges of the world she had escaped, always looking over her shoulder, always measuring her steps, always feeling the absence of the man who had once held her heart so completely, yet never daring to look back too long, never daring to hope that he had thought of her. Because hope had been a luxury she could not afford in the shadow of his empire and the ever-present threat of enemies who would see both her and the child as leverage. And now, sitting in the quiet of her apartment with the baby's soft breathing and tiny hands curled against her chest, she realized that the fragile life she had fought to protect was now in jeopardy in ways she had anticipated, feared, and yet could never fully prepare for. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp vibration of her phone on the side table. A sudden intrusion that made her heart lurch violently. And when she picked it up, her fingers trembling. The screen illuminated with a message that stole the air from her lungs in an instant. He saw. He's coming. The words were simple, stark, and chilling in their clarity. A single sentence that carried the weight of inevitability. A confirmation that the one person she had spent years trying to avoid had discovered the truth she had worked so hard to conceal. And with that knowledge came a flood of emotions that threatened to drown her: fear, longing, guilt, and the unshakable knowledge that the careful walls she had built to protect herself and her son were about to crumble under the sheer force of Lucian's presence. She pressed the baby closer, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her chest. A fragile anchor that reminded her of what truly mattered. Of the life she had fought for, and yet even as she focused on that, her eyes darted toward the window, her instincts honed by years of running and hiding kicking in immediately. And there, in the shadow of the blinds, a faint movement caught her attention. A darkness that seemed to cling to the outside world like a predator stalking its prey. And a chill ran down her spine as the realization struck her with terrifying clarity: someone was watching, waiting, perhaps even preparing to strike. Their presence a silent threat that amplified the already unbearable tension coiling in her chest, making her pulse race and her thoughts spiral into a dizzying array of worst-case scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. She drew a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. And her eyes never left the shadow, tracing its vague outline with a mixture of dread and instinctive calculation, knowing that every decision she made in the next few moments could mean safety or disaster for the child in her arms. That every second counted, and that her choices could determine not just her survival, but the survival of the one person she loved more than herself, more than anything in the world. And as she sat there, trembling, aware of every sound, every flicker of movement outside the window, she realized that the years she had spent running, hiding, and protecting a secret had led to this moment: a confrontation with a past that refused to remain buried, a reckoning she had long feared, and a choice she could no longer avoid. Because the man who had been her world, her obsession, and her torment had finally discovered the truth. And the shadow outside made it clear that the storm was already at her doorstep, ready to engulf everything she had fought so hard to preserve, leaving her heart pounding, her mind racing, and her very soul bracing for the collision between the past, the present, and the dangerous, inescapable future that Lucian Dravon represented. Elira Voss pressed the baby tightly against her chest, feeling the fragile warmth of his tiny body as though it could somehow shield them from the chaos gathering outside. Her mind racing with strategies, escape routes, and contingencies she had memorized over the years of running, each one rehearsed in the quiet hours of sleepless nights. Each one now blending with a primal fear that this time, even her careful planning might not be enough to protect them. Because Lucian Dravon was not just coming, he was coming with the full force of a man who demanded answers, justice, and possession, and she knew, deep down, that there would be no negotiation, no half measures, and no room for hesitation once he arrived, only the raw confrontation of truth laid bare. The reckoning that had been inevitable from the moment he had seen the child. And the terror that accompanied that inevitability was compounded tenfold by the shadow she had glimpsed outside her window. A presence that seemed to watch, wait, and judge her every move. As if sensing the delicate balance of safety she had tried so desperately to maintain. Her breaths came fast and shallow, each inhale a sharp reminder of her own vulnerability. Each exhale a plea that the years she had spent in hiding, the careful construction of her life, and the love she had cultivated for her son would be enough to shield them from the collision that she knew was imminent. And yet even as she tried to ground herself in rational thought, the flood of emotions, the guilt for keeping the child from Lucian, the fear of what his arrival might mean, and the lingering, aching love she still felt for him, threatened to overwhelm her, making her hands shake as she adjusted the baby in her arms, whispering reassurances she barely believed. A litany of protective words she hoped could create a fragile barrier against the storm approaching their door. She thought back to the night she had fled, 2 years prior. The memory as vivid and raw as if it had happened yesterday, the screams echoing through the rain-soaked streets, The smell of gunpowder, the blood that had mingled with tears. The desperation that had propelled her into the shadows with her unborn child hidden safely beneath her coat. Every step a testament to the strength she had summoned, a strength that now, despite her fear, she clung to as the only weapon she had against the inevitable confrontation with the man who had shaped her past. The man who had seen her as both a sanctuary and a target. The man who had become a force of reckoning in her life without ever meaning to. Her fingers brushed a loose strand of hair from her face as she glanced again at the window, her eyes narrowing on the faint shadow that had not moved. A silent sentinel that seemed to signal that the world outside her apartment had shifted irrevocably. That the careful illusion of safety she had maintained for so long had been shattered the moment Lucian's eyes had fallen on the child. And that now, every second counted, every decision carried weight. And every breath she took was a delicate negotiation between fear and courage. She imagined his face, the storm-gray intensity of his eyes, the weight of authority and danger that he carried naturally. And her heart ached at the thought of what he might do, how he might react. How the years of separation and secrecy would clash violently with the undeniable fact that their son existed. That he was real, and that he had become the center of a story neither of them could deny or control any longer. The baby stirred, letting out a small, soft whimper that drew her gaze and reminded her with crushing clarity that this was not about revenge, anger, or fear, it was about survival, protection, and love, pure and unfiltered. The kind that demanded instinct, courage, and sacrifices that no words could prepare her for. And she held him closer, whispering his name in hushed tones, trying to calm both him and herself even as her mind raced, calculating routes of escape, possible weapons, neighbors, and exits, trying to anticipate every angle, every variable. Because the shadow outside and the inevitability of Lucian's arrival meant that hesitation could cost them everything. Could shatter the fragile semblance of life she had fought so hard to preserve. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she allowed herself one final, desperate thought, a prayer almost, that he would not harm the baby, that he would understand the choices she had made, that he would arrive not as a monster of vengeance but as a man still capable of love. And though she knew this hope was fragile, it was the only thing she had left to cling to. And as the minutes stretched, each one feeling like an eternity, she kept her gaze fixed on the window, the shadow, the street beyond. Her heart a drum of anxiety and anticipation, readying herself for the confrontation she had tried to avoid for so long. Knowing that when Lucian Dravon arrived, nothing would ever be the same again. And that the fragile peace she had built for herself and her son would be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. As the inevitability of the past colliding with the present loomed large, threatening to engulf them in a storm of emotion, power, and reckoning that would leave no one unchanged, and as the night deepened, the shadow outside remained, silent and watchful, a reminder that the world was no longer theirs alone, and that whatever came next, they would have to face it together. With courage, with fear, and with the raw, unrelenting force of love that had always defined their bond in ways even time and distance could not erase. Lucian Dravon's penthouse erupted into chaos as the full force of his anguish and fury manifested in a way that terrified even the men who had spent years following his every command without question. A tempest of emotion so violent and uncontrollable that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the building as vases shattered, porcelain splintering across the marble floor, and chairs flew like missiles across the room, leaving jagged trails in the air and echoing with the sound of destruction that was at once both terrifying and hypnotic. While Lucian's massive frame moved with the grace of a predator and the fury of a storm, each punch into the walls cracking his knuckles, leaving behind dents and cracks that spoke of a man who was not merely angry, but fundamentally undone. A man whose heart had been torn open by betrayal, secrecy, and the revelation that the one woman who had ever mattered to him had concealed from him the very essence of his own blood. His chest heaved, muscles taut, face contorted, eyes blazing like twin infernos, and his voice, when it escaped in a low, ragged murmur, broke through the haze of destruction as he whispered, almost to himself, "She hid my child from me," the words catching in his throat, laden with grief, disbelief, and the raw sting of loss that threatened to drown him in its weight. For every memory of Elira, the nights they had spent entwined, the moments of laughter and warmth, the dreams they had once shared, collided violently with the reality of a secret that had festered behind her carefully constructed walls. A truth that had been denied to him until now. And that denial burned hotter than any flame he had ever known. A fire that consumed reason and left only instinct in its wake. Then, as if that storm of grief and shock were not enough to propel him into a state of sheer, merciless action, his fury transformed, sharpened, focused into something far more dangerous. A precision born of desperation and determination. His words sliced through the chaos like a blade, commanding, relentless, and absolute. Find her. Now. Those two words, simple and cold, carried the weight of a man who would tolerate nothing. A man who had been both king and executioner in a world of shadows and blood. And his men, trained to obey without hesitation, scrambled into action, their fear palpable as they sensed the depth of destruction simmering beneath the surface of their boss's wrath. Knowing that failure was not an option. And that any delay could bring ruin upon all of them, not just Lucian. Lorenzo, his right hand, the one man who had stood beside him through battles, betrayals, and bloodshed, came racing back minutes later. Urgency etched into every line of his face, a testament to the knowledge that what they faced was not merely a routine hunt, but a pursuit dictated by a force that defied reason. Boss. We tracked her phone. But, the hesitation in Lorenzo's voice was subtle. Almost imperceptible, yet it was enough to make Lucian lift his head. Icy eyes burning with a deadly intensity that made the very air tremble, and he demanded. A growl that vibrated with raw authority, but what? The words were not just a question, they were a challenge, a warning, and a declaration that any obstacle between him and Elira would be annihilated without mercy. Lorenzo swallowed, his pulse racing, knowing that the words he had to say would either ignite the full extent of Lucian's wrath or compel him to act with a precision that few could withstand. The signal was intercepted. A rival group is going after her first. The words landed like a hammer, reverberating in the space between them. And Lucian's jaw clenched so hard that the skin split slightly, a thin line of blood emerging. Yet he did not flinch, his rage only intensifying. His dominance and protective instinct merging into a singular, unstoppable force. No one touches what's mine, he growled. Every syllable carrying the weight of years of power, danger, and ferocity, a statement not merely of possession, but of warning to anyone who might underestimate the depth of his attachment, the ferocity of his claim, and the lethal precision with which he would execute any threat to what he considered his own. Without another word, he stormed toward the exit of the penthouse. The sound of his footsteps echoing like a drumbeat of impending reckoning, the men following closely behind. Tension and fear threading through the air like a live wire ready to ignite. For they all knew that Lucian Dravon was no longer merely a leader, they were following a man who had been broken, betrayed, and reborn in a fire of fury so absolute that it made even seasoned soldiers pause in awe and apprehension. Their eyes darting to one another, silently acknowledging that whatever awaited them outside would test every skill, every instinct, and every ounce of courage they possessed. As Lucian stormed through the corridor, the sleek leather of his coat swishing with every step, he imagined Elira, the child, the city beyond, and the inevitable collision with enemies who had somehow sensed the same truth. And his mind raced, strategizing, anticipating, and preparing for the confrontation that loomed like a predator in the night. A confrontation that would demand all of his cunning, all of his ferocity, and all of the raw, untamed power that had earned him both fear and respect in equal measure, for he knew that the rival group, the shadows moving closer to Elira, were already ahead of him, inching toward a prize he would not relinquish under any circumstances. And the knowledge that time was slipping away, that the child was in immediate danger, and that any hesitation could result in catastrophe, only fueled the fire within him, sharpening his senses, heightening his awareness, and driving him forward with a single, unrelenting purpose, a purpose that left no room for error, no tolerance for delay, and no mercy for those who dared cross him. Because Lucian Dravon, in that moment, was no longer just a man, he was a force of nature, a storm of vengeance, and a protector risen to reclaim what was rightfully his. And as he moved toward the night, toward the chaos, toward the inevitability of confrontation, the world itself seemed to shrink in the shadow of his presence, signaling that the dragon had risen, and that nothing and no one would stand in his way. Lucian Dravon's boots pounded the marble floors of his mansion as he stormed toward the waiting fleet of vehicles outside, the sound echoing like gunfire through the halls, each step a testament to the urgency and uncontainable fury coursing through him. And with every heartbeat, the image of Elira and the child replayed in his mind, haunting and driving him at once, a visceral mix of desperation and rage that left no room for hesitation or doubt. For he knew that while he had been caught in his own storm of grief and anger, his enemies were already moving, already closing the distance. And each passing second without action was another second they could reach the one person he could never bear to see harmed. Lorenzo trailed closely behind, his eyes scanning the floors and hallways as he relayed details to Lucian in low, urgent tones, every word a calculation of risk, every pause an acknowledgement of the impossible task ahead. And yet even Lorenzo, seasoned as he was, felt the tremor of awe and fear in the presence of a man who had been shattered, whose pain had now become a weapon as sharp and lethal as any blade or gun he commanded. A man whose mind burned with a single directive: retrieve what was his, no matter the cost. As they burst out of the mansion doors into the cool night air, the city lights flickering off the glassy surfaces of parked cars, Lucian's eyes swept the streets with the precision of a predator, scanning for any signs of movement, any anomaly that might indicate a rival faction's approach. His mind moving faster than the vehicles roaring beneath them, strategizing intercepts, escape routes, and traps in real time. Because in the world he ruled, speed, anticipation, and dominance were the difference between survival and disaster. And tonight, the stakes could not have been higher. His son, the child who embodied both the innocence of life and the bloodline of his own legacy, was in jeopardy, and Lucian Dravon would allow no one to claim what was his, no matter how calculated or well-planned their moves might be. He thought of Elira, of the sacrifices she had made, of the years of separation that had pained him silently, and yet he could not afford the luxury of sentiment. Not now, when the clock was against him, when every second could bring danger closer to the fragile life he had never expected to find, and his mind snapped into tactical focus. Memory, instinct, and rage merging into a single, unstoppable force that left no room for error, hesitation, or compromise. For Lucian Dravon was a man who had built an empire on precision, fear, and absolute control. And now that control extended to the protection of the child he had been denied. The child who had become the center of everything. And the enemy, whatever their numbers or cunning, would feel the full weight of his wrath. The vehicles roared into the streets, tires screeching against the asphalt as Lucian's mind traced every alley, every possible shortcut, every surveillance route he had memorized over years of building his network. His eyes darting from shadows to streetlights to rooftops, analyzing the night itself as though it were a living map of threats and opportunities. And with every passing moment, the reality became painfully clear: his enemies were faster than anticipated, closer than he had imagined, and if he did not reach Elira first, the consequences would be catastrophic, a thought that ignited a deeper fire in his chest, sharpening his focus into a dangerous, precise hunger. A determination that left no space for fear, only action, only movement, only the cold, unstoppable drive to reclaim what was his. He barked orders to his men in rapid succession, each command crisp, lethal, and unquestionable, the words cutting through the night air like blades: block the avenues, cut the routes. No mistakes. She does not leave the city without us, and his team responded with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Adrenaline coursing through their veins as they felt the intensity of their leader, the danger of the moment, and the weight of the task they had been entrusted with. Knowing that failure was unthinkable, and that the consequences of miscalculation would extend far beyond personal loss to the wrath of a man who had been broken, enraged, and transformed by grief into something more dangerous than any adversary they had ever faced. The city blurred around them as they navigated the streets, Lucian's mind a storm of calculations, possibilities, and contingencies, his fury driving him forward. His instinct sharpening every decision, every maneuver, every glance to ensure that they were always one step closer than those who sought to intercept Elira. And yet even as he moved with the unstoppable force of a storm, a part of him could not suppress the gnawing fear. The deep, visceral dread that time might run out. That the enemy would strike first, and that the fragile life they sought to protect, the child who had become the axis of his existence, would be in danger before he could reach them. And as the night deepened, as headlights cut through shadows and the roar of engines filled the streets, Lucian Dravon's resolve solidified into something beyond anger, beyond grief, beyond even the love that had sustained him in the past. It became a singular, unstoppable force. A force that demanded one outcome and one outcome only: Elira and the child would be his. Untouched, unharmed, and reclaimed from the shadows that sought to take them first. For in this night, in this pursuit, in this inevitable collision of destiny, Lucian Dravon had risen fully into the dragon he had always been feared to be, a creature of fire, vengeance, and unbreakable will. And yet, no matter how fast he moved, no matter how precise his strategy, no matter how sharp his fury, one terrifying truth remained: his enemies were already closer to Elira than he was. And the realization alone was enough to send a cold spike of tension through his veins. A reminder that in this game of power, blood, and love, even the most fearsome dragon could face the edge of peril before its fire found its mark. Elira Voss's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps as she sprinted through the empty, dimly lit street, the baby pressed tightly against her chest. His small arms curled protectively around her as if sensing the danger that had descended upon them, the city lights flickering intermittently, casting fleeting shadows across the pavement and amplifying the terror coiling in her chest like a live wire, while her heart hammered violently against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that mirrored the pounding of her feet against the asphalt. And every instinct screamed at her to keep moving, to never slow down, to never stop. For the armed men pursuing her represented not merely a threat to her life, but to the life of the child who had become the axis of everything she had fought to protect. The living symbol of love, secrecy, and a bond with Lucian Dravon that had never truly been broken. And yet now, exposed in the cold night air, she felt the enormity of the danger more acutely than ever. A danger that was closing in faster than she could anticipate, threatening to undo every careful step she had taken over the years to keep her son safe. Headlights cut through the darkness like knives, blinding and disorienting as a sleek black SUV screeched to a halt mere meters away, the tires skidding sharply against the street, throwing sparks that mirrored the chaos erupting in her mind. And from the vehicle leapt armed men, each one a moving silhouette of menace, their guns raised, voices shouting her name with venom and authority: Elira Voss. The baby, give him to us. He's leverage for Lucian Dravon. The words hit her like a physical blow, sending a jolt of terror through her knees, threatening to buckle them beneath the weight of imminent danger. Yet she forced herself to remain upright, driven by sheer instinct, adrenaline, and the primal need to survive and protect the child, whose eyes, wide with fear and confusion, mirrored her own desperation, and who seemed impossibly fragile against the backdrop of violence and hostility that had erupted around them in a matter of seconds. One of the attackers lunged for her, fingers digging into her arm with merciless force, and she cried out, a sound choked with panic, "No. No, please." Her voice raw, urgent, and pleading, a desperate appeal that she knew might fall on deaf ears, until a sudden, thunderous sound ripped through the night like an explosion, scattering the would-be captors and freezing them momentarily in shock. Their focus broken by a new, undeniable force entering the scene, a force that moved with deadly precision and raw, unrelenting power. A sleek black car drifted into the chaos, tires squealing against the asphalt, its engine growl echoing like a predator announcing its presence. And before anyone could react further, Lucian Dravon emerged from the vehicle, every inch of him radiating controlled fury and lethal intent. Fire blazing in his eyes, a storm of vengeance and protection coiling in his veins. As though every moment of rage, grief, and desperation from the past 2 years had culminated in this exact instant. And the world itself had contracted to a single purpose, the defense of what was his. What had been denied, and what he would never relinquish again. Gunfire erupted, precise, unerring, and deadly. Each shot finding its mark with the effortless efficiency that only Lucian Dravon could command, and one by one, the attackers fell. Their plan collapsing under the merciless force of a man who had been both broken and reborn. A man who had been torn apart by love and loss only to rise more dangerous, more unstoppable, and more terrifying than any enemy could comprehend. And when the last threat dropped silently to the ground, the street once again fell into a tense, almost surreal silence, broken only by the distant echoes of gunfire and the harsh ragged breaths of those left standing. Lucian's eyes swept immediately to Elira, who was frozen, clutching the baby as if she were the only anchor in a world gone mad. And in that instant, the monster, the rage, the fury that had consumed him moments ago vanished, replaced by a man who had once loved. A man whose every scar and shadowed memory now paled in comparison to the urgency of holding the child, the living proof of their connection, safely in his arms. He moved toward her with a controlled speed that belied the torrent of emotion inside him. Each step measured, deliberate, yet filled with an irresistible pull toward her. Until he stood before her, his chest heaving, his gaze softening just enough to reveal the man she had once known. The man who had loved her with a ferocity she had never forgotten. And his voice, when it came, was a whisper, low, raw, and trembling with emotion. "Elira? Give me the child." The words hung between them, heavy with history, unspoken confessions, and the undeniable truth that she could no longer hide. And as she looked into his eyes, the realization she had carried for years escaped in a hushed tremor. "Lucian. He's your son." His breath caught, shattering into fragments as if the revelation had struck him physically. And the world around them contracted further, leaving only the three of them, the man, the woman, and the child, standing amid the wreckage of chaos and gunfire. The night air thick with the scent of gunpowder and the unspoken understanding that their lives had irreversibly collided. But the moment of fragile reunion was pierced by a new sound. Distant yet unmistakable, sirens wailing, growing louder by the second, blending with the echoes of approaching vehicles, gunfire, and the footsteps of more enemies closing in on their location. And Lucian's gaze sharpened immediately, his body coiling like a predator sensing imminent threat. A storm of protective instinct igniting once more. His hand reaching for Elira's as he pulled her close. His eyes locking with hers in a silent, urgent command, "We have to disappear. Now," the words carrying a weight that left no room for hesitation. A forceful declaration that in the next moments, their survival, their bond, and the life of the child depended entirely on their speed, instinct, and unity, and that the night, with all its chaos, danger, and uncertainty, was far from over. Lucian Dravon's grip on Elira's hand was iron-strong, his pulse and adrenaline syncing with hers as they bolted down the alleyways. The city a blur of flickering neon lights and shadows that seemed to stretch like dark fingers reaching for them, the baby securely cradled between them. His soft breaths a fragile rhythm that reminded Lucian of everything he had nearly lost and everything he would fight to protect. While the sirens in the distance grew louder, slicing through the night like a warning, a countdown, and a promise of danger that made each heartbeat, each step, each breath, feel magnified, urgent, and vital. For there was no room to falter, no time to hesitate, and no space for mercy in a world where enemies moved faster than they had imagined, ready to seize the one thing that made Lucian vulnerable, that connected him to a past he had tried to bury and a future he now refused to let slip away. Elira stumbled once, knees nearly giving out under the weight of terror, exhaustion, and the child in her arms, and he caught her immediately, pulling her back to his side with a force that was protective, possessive, and desperate all at once. His eyes sweeping the surrounding streets with deadly precision, calculating, predicting, anticipating every possible ambush, every hidden corner where danger might be lurking, while simultaneously keeping the baby shielded from view. his hands steady, strong, and unwavering. A fortress around the small, innocent life that had just become the center of his existence. Around them, the city seemed to pulse with menace. Every shadow a potential threat, every distant engine a signal that time was slipping faster than their legs could carry them. And yet, Lucian moved with a predator's grace. His instincts honed over years of power, blood, and survival guiding him through the maze of streets with unerring accuracy, each decision split-second and perfect. For he understood that hesitation was fatal and mistakes were luxury they could not afford. The distant shouts of their pursuers reached their ears, muffled but unmistakable, punctuated by the sharp reports of gunfire echoing through the alleys. And he knew their enemies were closing in, closing the gap between predator and prey with deadly intent. But Lucian's mind was a storm of focus and rage. Every ounce of him dedicated to the protection of Elira and the child, to the reclamation of what had been hidden, and to the destruction of anyone foolish enough to think they could interfere with the bloodline of Lucian Dravon. His eyes flicked to Elira, and he saw fear, exhaustion, and a faint glimmer of hope mingled in her gaze. And in that instant, he made a silent promise. Unspoken yet absolute, she would never endure harm while he drew breath. And the child would be safe, no matter the cost. As they turned a corner, narrowly avoiding a parked car that could have blocked their escape, Lucian felt the raw heat of anger flare inside him. Not just for the threat that pursued them, but for the years of secrets, lies, and stolen time that had brought them to this moment. A fire that fueled his every step, sharpened his every decision, and drove him forward with a singular, unstoppable purpose. For nothing would stand between him and the family he had only just discovered. Nothing would delay him from reclaiming what was his. And nothing would stop the dragon that had risen in the wake of betrayal and revelation. The sirens grew closer, now joined by the unmistakable sounds of additional vehicles. The pounding of tires and the shuffle of gunmen moving with precision and coordination. Yet Lucian remained unshakable, a human force of nature, moving with the lethal grace of a man who had survived every conceivable danger and emerged stronger, deadlier, and more determined, his every sense heightened, his every movement guided by instinct and unrelenting will. And all the while, the baby slept, oblivious to the storm surrounding him. A serene contrast to the chaos and danger that threatened to swallow them whole. When they reached a narrow side street, Lucian pressed Elira against the wall, scanning the horizon with a predator's precision, the tension coiling in his muscles like a drawn bow, and whispered urgently, "We can't stop here. We need to disappear. Now." The weight of his words, of his urgency, of his authority, settled on Elira like a tangible force, and she nodded, trembling but trusting him completely, for she knew, as she always had, that Lucian's instincts, his strength, and his obsession with what was his could bend the laws of the world itself, and that following him was their only chance to survive the night. With a controlled yet explosive burst of speed, they moved again, weaving through alleys, vaulting over trash bins, and darting past shadows that seemed to stretch in anticipation of their flight. The sounds of sirens, gunfire, and pursuit chasing them relentlessly. And yet Lucian's mind remained razor-sharp, his perception flawless, calculating routes, timing, and threats with a precision born of years at the apex of a violent empire, for he understood that one misstep, one hesitation, one fraction of a second delay, could mean the end of everything they fought to protect. The adrenaline, the fear, the love, and the unrelenting need to shield his son and Elira from harm fused into a single, unstoppable force within him. A force that made him move faster, strike harder, and act with a clarity that few men could ever achieve. And yet even in the eye of the storm, he allowed himself a fleeting glance at Elira, at the baby, at the fragile life that had become the epicenter of his existence. And he felt a surge of emotion so profound it nearly shattered the carefully maintained mask of the man who commanded fear across the city, leaving only a father, a protector, and a man desperately reclaiming what had been hidden from him. But the moment of triumph was tempered by the haunting knowledge that the world behind them was closing in, that sirens and enemies alike drew ever nearer, and that the next few minutes would decide whether they escaped into the night as a family or fell victim to forces beyond their control. And with that realization, Lucian's grip on Elira's hand tightened. His eyes locking onto the horizon, and with one final, sharp command, he propelled them forward into the unknown, the night alive with danger, urgency, and the undeniable certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. Lucian Dravon's vehicle tore through the winding mountain roads with a precision and urgency born from years of commanding empires and evading threats that would have crushed lesser men. The tires kicking up gravel and dust behind them like the trail of a storm in motion, while Elira clutched the baby to her chest, his tiny fingers curling around hers as her heart thudded with exhaustion, terror, and a fragile sense of relief, for in the distance, beyond the reach of the city and the enemies who had almost captured them, lay a sanctuary known only to Lucian. A hidden safe house perched high among jagged peaks and shadowed forests. A fortress carved from both secrecy and desperation. Designed for moments like these when the world seemed intent on tearing them apart and leaving nothing but chaos in its wake. As the black SUV skidded to a halt, Lucian's eyes darted over the surroundings, scanning for threats with the same vigilance that had kept him alive through years of wars, betrayals, and bloodshed, every muscle coiled and ready. And yet, despite the lingering tension, a subtle, almost imperceptible warmth crept into his chest as he watched the baby shift in Elira's arms, tiny eyes wide and curious, the faintest flicker of a smile tugging at his lips even as exhaustion and fear threatened to overtake them all. When he stepped inside the hidden refuge, the baby reached out, fingers brushing against Lucian's calloused hand, and for the first time since learning of his existence, the child smiled, a small, innocent curve of lips that carried no pretense. No fear, only the pure, unfiltered essence of life. And in that moment, Lucian froze, the world narrowing to a single point of clarity, his heart threatening to shatter and reconstruct itself in the span of one heartbeat. For in that tiny, delicate expression, he saw an echo of himself, an unspoken reflection of his own eyes, his own soul, and the legacy he had fought to protect in ways that had never been so tangible, so real, and so profoundly moving. "He looks exactly like I did," Lucian whispered, voice thick, raw, and trembling with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. And the words hung in the air like a fragile thread connecting the past, the present, and the uncertain future. A bridge between the monster the world feared and the father he had only just discovered himself to be. Elira nodded softly, tears brimming in her eyes, and whispered, "I tried to tell you. But your world was too dangerous," her voice barely audible, tinged with regret, love, and fear. A combination that both wounded and stirred something deep within Lucian, igniting a fire that had nothing to do with anger or revenge, but with the overwhelming, unrelenting force of a love that had never truly died. A love that had endured years of absence, secrecy, and suffering, waiting for the precise moment when it could reassert itself with undeniable clarity. Lucian stepped closer, his gaze locking onto hers, every line of his body radiating authority, protection, and the vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to glimpse. And in a voice softer than she had expected yet weighted with absolute sincerity, he said, "My world? Elira, you were my world. You still are." A tear slipped down her cheek as her heart wrenched under the weight of emotions long denied, and she choked out a whisper, trembling and fragile, "Then why didn't you come for me?" The question hung in the air, raw and piercing. A direct confrontation of the past and present, of choices made and sacrifices endured. And Lucian's jaw clenched as he swallowed hard, his voice low, thick with pain and love, as he admitted, "Because letting you go was the only unselfish thing I've ever done," words that revealed the depth of his internal struggle, the magnitude of his restraint, and the unspoken acknowledgement that even a man as feared and ruthless as Lucian Dravon had limits, and that love sometimes demanded acts of courage that surpassed brute force, domination, and vengeance. Elira's body shuddered as the weight of that admission broke her defenses, shattering the walls she had meticulously constructed around her heart for years. And for a moment, the world outside the mountain ceased to exist, leaving only the fragile bubble of intimacy, pain, and longing that had finally, painfully, been reclaimed. But the fragile peace, as always, was fleeting. For the universe rarely allowed a moment of reprieve for those living at the intersection of love, power, and danger, and suddenly, a thunderous explosion ripped through the air, shaking the very foundations of the hidden house, splintering wood, rattling glass, and throwing Elira against Lucian's chest. The baby yelping in alarm and fear, and in that instant, Lucian reacted without hesitation, instinctively positioning his body as a shield. Wrapping Elira and the child within the fortress of his arms, muscles coiled and senses blazing. Every nerve screaming with adrenaline, awareness, and the raw, unrelenting need to protect what was his. The smell of gunpowder, smoke, and scorched earth filled the room as debris fell around them. And the sound of chaos outside, the pounding of boots, shouts, and the unmistakable clatter of weapons being readied, made it clear that they had been found. That the enemies Lucian had so feared were now upon them. And that no sanctuary, no matter how hidden, could fully contain the storm that had arrived at their doorstep. Lucian's eyes, dark, stormy, and impossibly sharp, scanned every corner of the room, every potential breach, every possible exit. Calculating, anticipating, preparing for the inevitable confrontation that would determine not only their survival but the fragile thread of family they had begun to reclaim. And as armed men began flooding the mountain from multiple directions, surrounding the hideaway with precision and deadly intent, the weight of the situation pressed down on him like the mountains themselves, leaving no room for hesitation, no tolerance for mistakes, and only the stark reality that the next moments would demand every ounce of his skill, every shred of his power, and every ounce of the ferocity that had earned him the fear and respect of the underworld. For Lucian Dravon now understood that there would be no second chances, no mercy for the trespassers, and no escape unless he wielded every weapon at his disposal. Even if it meant risking everything he had fought to reclaim, the mountain air was thick with tension, heavy with smoke and the acrid scent of gunpowder that seeped through the windows and into the hidden safe house. As Lucian Dravon pressed himself tighter against Elira, shielding her and the baby with a precision born of instinct, experience, and pure, unrelenting desperation, while his eyes, dark and stormy, darted to every possible vantage point, analyzing every shadow, every glint of metal, every sound that could betray the movements of the armed men swarming the mountain outside. Their footsteps crunching against gravel, weapons raised, voices barking orders that carried a deadly finality. And Lucian's mind raced, calculating paths, exits, improvised defenses, and ambushes. Because even in the face of overwhelming odds, he was Lucian Dravon, the man who had built an empire from blood, fear, and ruthless strategy. And he would not allow the life of his son, nor the woman he had never stopped loving, to be taken from him without a fight that would leave every intruder regretting the moment they dared to set foot on his territory. Elira clung to him, trembling, her body pressed against his as her chest heaved with the mingled sensations of terror, relief, and awe, witnessing the transformation of the man who had once been a distant, untouchable figure in her life into a living storm of protection and vengeance. A force she could both rely upon and fear, a man whose love was now inseparable from the ferocity of his rage, and whose gaze could kill and comfort in the same moment, as if the universe had conspired to make him both angel and executioner in the same breath. The baby, oblivious to the chaos and danger, nestled his small head against Lucian's chest, his tiny fingers curling instinctively around his father's hand, and in that innocent gesture, Lucian felt something shatter and rebuild simultaneously, the barrier between the monster the world feared and the man who was now a father, the protector of a fragile life that had already irrevocably changed him. And the realization fueled a fire within him that could not be quenched by walls, distance, or enemies, only fanned by the certainty that those who threatened them would not leave alive. Lucian moved with deadly grace, positioning himself near the entrances, scanning the terrain beyond the windows, noting the angles of attack, the distances, the cover his enemies might use, and all the while, every muscle in his body was coiled like a spring, ready to explode into action. For he understood with absolute clarity that the next minutes could decide not only their survival but the future of a life he had only just discovered. A life that was his by blood, by fate, and by the unbreakable bond of love. Elira, despite her fear, watched him with a mixture of admiration, awe, and lingering pain, understanding now more than ever why she had loved him, why she had feared for her life around him, and why, even in his absence, he had remained the most powerful force in her heart. And when he finally spoke, low, commanding, and yet tinged with the tenderness that only she could elicit, "Stay close. Don't move until I give you a signal," she obeyed immediately. Instincts honed by years of running and surviving converging with the trust she had finally restored in him. Knowing that in this man, this storm incarnate, lay the only path to safety, and that for their son, they had no choice but to follow without question. Outside, the attackers began positioning themselves, sweeping the perimeter, their boots crunching against the rocky terrain, rifles raised, tactical gestures signaling coordination and lethal intent. And Lucian's eyes narrowed as he traced every movement, every shadow, every hint of approach, calculating trajectories, probabilities, and outcomes with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime predicting danger, manipulating situations, and asserting dominance over the chaos of the criminal underworld. Now applying all of it to the protection of a life that mattered more than power, more than vengeance, more than anything else he had ever fought for. And then, without hesitation, he began issuing rapid-fire commands, not to intimidate, but to orchestrate a defense, barricade the doors, set traps near the windows. Keep your eyes on the slopes. Don't let anyone breach, fire on my mark, and the words flowed like a river of steel and authority. And Elira felt both the fear and reassurance of standing behind a man who had been, for years, the apex of danger and now the apex of protection. For she knew he would leave no stone unturned, no threat unchallenged, and no enemy alive if they dared come closer. Seconds felt like hours as they waited. The baby asleep once again against Lucian's chest, oblivious to the tension around him. And in that brief lull, Elira dared to glance at Lucian, seeing not only the predator, the Mafia boss, and the storm of fury, but also the man who had loved her, who had fought to protect her in ways she had never fully comprehended. And she allowed herself the fleeting hope that perhaps, together, they could survive this, perhaps the world could bend for once in their favor, if only for the smallest of moments. But that hope was brutally interrupted by the unmistakable sound of movement at the outer perimeter, the metallic scrape of weapons being readied, the voices of men coordinating for the final push. And Lucian's eyes hardened into cold steel. A storm contained in human form, as he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else, "They think they can take what is mine. They are about to find out why that was the deadliest mistake of their lives," and in the next heartbeat, the safe house erupted into controlled chaos once more. Lucian moving with lethal precision, blocking doorways, securing angles, and preparing for the inevitable breach, his mind a lethal instrument honed for this exact moment. Knowing full well that the next few minutes would test not only his tactical genius and physical prowess but also the fragile thread of family they had just begun to reclaim. For outside, armed men flooded the mountain, surrounding the hideaway, leaving no escape, no compromise, and no mercy, and the storm of reckoning had finally arrived at their doorstep. The chaos outside the mountain safe house had reached a fever pitch, the night air pierced by the thunderous roar of gunfire, the shouts of men coordinated and relentless, the smell of smoke and cordite thick and suffocating, and in the midst of it all, Lucian Dravon moved with the lethal precision of a man who had been forged in fire. His instincts sharper than steel, muscles coiled, eyes scanning every angle, every shadow, every potential threat as he shoved Elira and their baby into a hidden panic room carved into the rock beneath the safe house. His hands steady, commanding, protective, closing the heavy door behind them with a metallic clang that resonated like a final heartbeat of safety for the fragile lives he had sworn to protect. And he turned to her, his chest heaving with adrenaline, every inch of him radiating a primal force of strength, determination, and love, cupping her face in his hands, his gaze searing into hers, words low, deadly, and filled with raw emotion. "Stay here. No matter what you hear," he said, his voice both an order and a vow, a promise that no harm would come to them while he stood between danger and sanctuary. And though her lips quivered as she reached for him, saying his name, Lucian, he silenced her with a look that carried the weight of his entire being. The kind of look that could command obedience, respect, and trust all at once, while he whispered, voice thick with emotion yet unwavering in its authority, I won't die. I refuse to leave my son fatherless. And then, with a tenderness that made her heart ache, he leaned down and kissed the baby's forehead. A soft, fleeting gesture of love, devotion, and protection, imprinting the memory of his presence into the child's tiny, delicate world. Before backing toward the door and locking it with a resolute finality, leaving only the muffled sounds of chaos beyond the reinforced walls. Outside, Lucian emerged like a shadow made flesh. The apex predator in a storm of fire and steel, every movement deliberate, deadly, and driven by the unshakable need to protect, to reclaim, and to annihilate anyone who dared threaten his family. And he moved like a demon possessed, bullets tearing through the night, fists striking with terrifying accuracy, every punch fueled by love, every shot fired by a rage so deep and pure it seemed almost elemental, a force of nature that no ordinary man could withstand. While Elira huddled in the darkness of the panic room, hands trembling as she held their son close, listening to every impact, every shout, every guttural roar of her lover, each sound a mixture of terror, hope, and awe. The raw proof that he was fighting not only for his life but for theirs. For the fragile thread of family that had been forged from blood, sacrifice, and love. A thread that no enemy could sever without paying a price in fear and pain. Time became fluid, stretching and compressing as the battle raged. Gunfire echoing through the mountains, wood splintering, stone cracking, bodies falling with thuds and muffled groans. Yet Lucian never wavered, never faltered. Moving with the precision of a man who had stared death in the face countless times and now fought not for empire, not for power, but for the lives of those who had become his world. The son who was blood of his blood, and the woman who had never stopped being his heart. And when a brief silence fell, heavy and unnatural, Elira's breath caught in her throat, the only sound the frantic thump of her own heart. And she strained to listen, desperate for any sign of his survival. Any hint that the monster had been vanquished and replaced once again by the man who loved her beyond reason. Then, faint but deliberate, came the sound of footsteps approaching the door. Each step measured, deliberate, and echoing with intent. And panic clawed at her chest as she pressed herself and the baby against the wall, whispering prayers into the dark. Hoping, begging, for the familiar voice. The familiar presence of Lucian, to break through the suffocating tension. And the tapping of the door began. Soft, slow, deliberate, sending shivers down her spine. Every second stretching into eternity as she waited for a whisper that could mean salvation or doom. Elira. A voice rasped, low and familiar. And she froze, breath catching, eyes wide. A mixture of hope, fear, and disbelief coursing through her as the world seemed to hold its breath. And in that instant, every second of running, every shot fired, every tear shed, every moment of separation and longing, condensed into the pure, unbearable weight of that single word. Spoken in the tone that only Lucian Dravon could command, every syllable carrying his essence. His love, his fury, and his promise of protection. And she whispered a shaky prayer, please? Let it be him. The door creaked open slowly. And there he was, stumbling, bleeding, sweat and grime streaking his face. Clothes torn and bloodied from the battle outside. But alive, defiant, and indomitable, falling to his knees in front of her. The raw energy of a man who had survived death itself radiating off him as he lifted their baby gently into his arms. The child's tiny form a beacon of innocence and vulnerability amid the carnage. And with every motion, Lucian's eyes burned with a light that mixed rage, love, and relief, a fire no enemy could extinguish. No one takes my family, he whispered, voice hoarse, yet every word loaded with absolute authority, and he cradled the baby close, a shield and promise in one motion, murmuring, this is my son. And I swear, before the sudden, terrifying red dot appeared on the baby's blanket. A sniper's laser cutting through the dim light. And in that instant, Lucian's face went white, eyes widening. The roar of his scream tearing through the panic room, Elira, get down. His voice splitting the night, raw and primal. The embodiment of a father's last stand. The ultimate expression of love, rage, and desperation. As every ounce of strength, skill, and instinct he possessed surged to protect the two lives he had fought so hard to reclaim. And the world seemed to shrink to a single moment suspended in blood, fire, and fate, with sirens wailing outside. Bodies shifting, hearts hammering, and the very air charged with the inevitability of the battle yet to come. Leaving only the screaming echo of a man determined to defy death itself in the name of love, family, and vengeance. Lucian Dravon's roar echoed through the panic room, reverberating off the reinforced walls as he lunged with explosive force, pinning Elira and their baby low to the ground, his hands a fortress over them. Every muscle coiled like a predator ready to strike. The sound of bullets tearing through the air outside a deafening symphony of death and chaos, each impact making the walls shudder, and yet, in that maelstrom of fire, smoke, and danger, Lucian's focus never wavered. His mind a razor-sharp instrument, calculating every trajectory, every sound, every shadow. Anticipating the sniper, the ambushers, the unknown threat that had zeroed in on the child he would die to protect. While Elira pressed herself against him, trembling violently, clutching the baby, heart hammering, tears streaking her face, and every sob a mixture of fear, relief, and the raw recognition that Lucian was her anchor, her protector, and the only man who could keep them alive in the storm of violence that had descended upon them. He could hear the sniper's breathing, the faint click of a scope adjusting, the distant shuffle of boots outside. And his entire being shifted into survival mode, instincts honed over years of warfare, bloodshed, and command snapping into perfection. His body a weapon as much as a shield, and even as the laser dot danced across the baby's blanket, he didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. Because to hesitate meant death, to falter meant failure. And failure was not an option for Lucian Dravon. He rolled, dragging Elira and the baby with him, using every ounce of his body weight, every ounce of strength, to create a protective barrier, while simultaneously assessing the room for anything he could use, furniture, steel reinforcements, even fragments of debris to shield them from the inevitable line of fire. His mind a whirlwind of tactical brilliance, his heart a furnace of love and rage, burning hotter with every second that their lives hung in the balance. "Stay down. Do not move," he barked, his voice slicing through panic like a blade. And Elira obeyed instinctively, tears blurring her vision as she pressed their son closer to her chest, whispering his name as if the sound alone could keep him safe. While Lucian's gaze flicked between the door, the windows, and the distant shadows outside, every fiber of his being tuned to detecting danger, to predicting motion, to ensuring that no bullet, no hand, no adversary could breach the sanctuary he had created. No matter how temporary, no matter how frail. The silence between gunfire and chaos was punctuated by tiny sounds, the click of a sniper adjusting, the faint scraping of shoes against gravel, the soft exhale of someone preparing to aim, and Lucian counted them, memorized them, catalogued every signal, every twitch, preparing for the split-second action that could save or doom them. And in that deadly calculus, he found clarity, purpose, and an unbreakable resolve, for the child in his arms was not just a son, not just a symbol of the past, but the living embodiment of everything he had fought for. And nothing, not even death itself, would take that from him. He moved again, rolling forward, ducking low, dragging Elira with him as the laser dot leapt along the blanket, a threat that seemed impossibly precise, impossibly close, and yet, for every move, for every evasion, for every desperate breath, he reminded himself of his vow, the promise whispered over blood and fire, no one takes my family. Outside, footsteps multiplied, echoing across the mountain as if the world itself had conspired to crush them under the weight of its violence. And the sound of shouts, commands, and gunfire created a chaotic symphony, the edges of which Lucian navigated with lethal grace. His body a shield, his mind a battlefield, his soul a storm of unrelenting fury, a fury that now had only one target, the sniper, the invaders, the world that dared touch the family he had claimed. loved, and would defend to his last breath. Elira's sobs were muffled against his shoulder as he pressed them down, her fingers gripping his arm like life itself depended on it. And indeed it did, for every second, every heartbeat, every breath was a delicate negotiation between survival and annihilation, between the fragility of life and the ruthless inevitability of the violence pressing in on them. And Lucian knew that the next moment could decide everything, could be the line between life and death, between the dawn of safety and the eternal darkness of loss. Then, from somewhere outside, a new sound, the barely audible whisper of movement, the faint rustle of clothing, alerted Lucian to a shift in the battle, a calculated move by the enemy. And his eyes, burning with focus and rage, snapped toward the threat, calculating angles, timing, and lethal response with the speed of a man whose life had always been measured in seconds and survival. For he understood that one misstep, one delay, one hesitation, could mean the end of everything he loved, the obliteration of the fragile hope he had carved out in the mountains of chaos. He rolled again, dragging Elira low, his body shielding the baby like an unbreakable fortress. And with a guttural roar, he lunged toward the nearest breach. Fists smashing, bullets tearing, his every movement a testament to the fury of a father unwilling to yield. While Elira clung to him, whispering prayers through trembling lips, every tear a silent plea for mercy, for safety, for life. As outside, the sniper adjusted, the red dot dancing once again across the baby's blanket. And the tension became unbearable, the seconds stretching into eternities, every fiber of their being screaming in anticipation of the inevitable strike. Lucian's chest heaved as he rose slightly, eyes locked on the laser, calculating, predicting, moving faster than thought itself, every heartbeat synchronized with the rhythm of battle. And in a voice that was both command and warning, he screamed, "Elira, move!" Dragging her violently but precisely, spinning their world in a desperate dance between death and survival. The baby cradled securely between them, every motion a lifeline, every breath a testament to the indomitable will of a man who would fight any force, defy any enemy, and challenge any death to protect what was his. And then, as the red dot hovered threateningly on the blanket once more, Lucian's eyes narrowed, his mind calculating the only possible outcome. The only way to survive, the only way to turn imminent death into a chance for life. The storm in his heart and soul igniting into a single, unstoppable surge of power, love, and fury that would decide not just the fate of one night, but the future of a family bound by blood, love, and the unrelenting will of a father determined to leave no enemy standing and no harm come to the son he had just claimed. And in that suspended heartbeat, the final, shattering cliffhanger held the world in deadly balance, every second dripping with suspense, terror, and the promise of unimaginable consequences.